The silence that followed my husband's words was deafening. Every face around the Thanksgiving table stared at me, waiting to see if I would crumble like I always had before. But this time, something was different. This time, I had the deed to their precious family farm folded neatly in my purse, and I was about to teach the Brennan family a lesson they'd never forget. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Catherine Murphy, though I haven't used my maiden name in 8 years. I grew up on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa, in a modest 2-bedroom house that my father built with his own hands. Dad worked double shifts at the grain elevator, while Mom cleaned houses for the wealthy families in town. They taught me that hard work and integrity mattered more than money or status, lessons that would serve me well in ways I never imagined. I met Daniel Brennan at Iowa State University during my junior year studying agricultural business. He was everything I thought I wanted. Tall, confident, from a family with deep roots in the community. The Brennans owned one of the largest corn and soybean operations in 3 counties, with over 2,000 acres of prime Iowa farmland that had been in their family for 4 generations. Daniel swept me off my feet with his easy charm and grand gestures. He'd pick me up in his lifted truck, take me to expensive restaurants in Des Moines, and talk about our future together on the family farm. I was a small-town girl who'd never been treated like a princess before, and I fell hard and fast. What I didn't understand then was that Daniel's attention came with conditions. He loved the idea of me, the hard-working farm girl who would fit perfectly into his family's image. But he had no interest in who I actually was beneath the surface. The Brennan family lived in a sprawling farmhouse that had been featured in Better Homes and Gardens twice. Margaret Brennan, Daniel's mother, ruled the household with the iron fist of someone who'd married into old money and never let anyone forget it. She was tall and severe, with silver hair always pulled back in a perfect chignon and a wardrobe that managed to look both practical and expensive. Thomas Brennan, Daniel's father, was quieter but no less intimidating. He'd inherited the farm from his father and doubled its size through shrewd land acquisitions and careful financial planning. He spoke little but expected absolute difference when he did speak. The farm was his kingdom, and everyone in the family understood their place in the hierarchy. Daniel's older brother Michael had always been the golden child. He'd studied agricultural engineering at Iowa State and returned home to modernize the farm's operations. He was married to Amanda, a doctor's daughter from Cedar Rapids who'd seamlessly integrated into the family's social circle. They had 2 perfect children and lived in a custom-built house on the farm property. Then there was Daniel's younger sister, Rebecca, who'd married a successful lawyer and moved to Chicago. She only returned for holidays and special occasions, but when she did, she made sure everyone knew how much more sophisticated her life was compared to rural Iowa. From the moment Daniel brought me home to meet his family, I felt the weight of their judgment. Margaret's first words to me were, "Oh, you're much smaller than I expected. Daniel usually goes for more substantial girls." Thomas barely acknowledged my presence, grunting a hello before returning to his newspaper. Michael and Amanda were polite but distant, treating me like a temporary fixture who would eventually be replaced by someone more suitable. But I was young and in love, and I convinced myself that I could win them over with time and effort. I threw myself into learning everything about farming, studying crop rotation schedules and livestock management. I helped Margaret with holiday preparations, complimented Amanda on her decorating choices, and laughed at Michael's stories about farm equipment breakdowns. Daniel seemed pleased with my efforts, but I began to notice small things that should have been red flags. He never defended me when his mother made cutting remarks about my background or appearance. He'd correct my grammar in front of his family, claiming he was helping me sound more educated. He started buying me clothes that matched Amanda's style, saying he wanted me to look more polished for family events. After we graduated, Daniel proposed on Christmas Eve in front of his entire family. It was a beautiful ring, a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother, and I was so overwhelmed with emotion that I didn't notice the calculating looks being exchanged around the room. Later, I would understand that the proposal had been as much about cementing my place in their hierarchy as it was about love. We married the following October, in a ceremony that Margaret planned down to the last detail. She chose my dress, my flowers, even my hairstyle, dismissing my preferences as inexperienced and not quite right for the Brennan family image. I told myself it didn't matter because I was marrying the man I loved, but looking back, I can see how systematically my identity was being erased. After the wedding, we moved into a small house on the farm property, about a quarter-mile from the main house. It was a cute place, originally built for hired hands, but Daniel made it clear this was temporary. Once his parents retired, we would inherit the main house and the farm operations. Until then, I was expected to help out wherever needed, while Daniel learned the business from his father. I put myself into farm life with enthusiasm. I learned to drive the grain truck during harvest season, helped with the bookkeeping, and even took on some of the cooking for the seasonal workers. I genuinely loved the work and found satisfaction in contributing to something larger than myself. But the Brennan family's treatment of me never improved. Margaret would critique everything from my cooking to my housekeeping, always with the caveat that she was just trying to help me become worthy of the Brennan name. Thomas would assign me the most menial tasks while praising Michael's innovations and Daniel's progress. Even the seasonal workers seemed to understand that I occupied a lower rung on the family ladder. Daniel's attitude toward me began to shift as well. The romantic gestures disappeared, replaced by constant corrections and criticisms. He'd point out when I used the wrong fork at family dinners, or mispronounced something in front of company. He started spending more time with his father and Michael, leaving me to handle household chores and errands that he considered beneath his attention. The worst part was how isolated I became. My old friends from college had moved away or gotten busy with their own lives. The local women my age were polite but kept their distance, whether out of respect for the Brennan family's position in the community or because they sensed I didn't really belong. I found myself spending long hours alone in our little house, questioning whether I was imagining the subtle hostility or if it was all in my head. 3 years into our marriage, something shifted in the family dynamics. Margaret started making pointed comments about our lack of children, suggesting that perhaps I had issues that needed medical attention. Thomas began excluding me from farm discussions, saying they were too complicated for someone without proper agricultural training, despite my degree in the field. Daniel stopped defending even my most basic contributions, often taking credit for my ideas when speaking to his father. I began to feel like a hired hand who happened to sleep in the family quarters. I was expected to work without complaint, contribute without recognition, and accept criticism without response. Any attempt to assert myself was met with reminders of how grateful I should be for the opportunity to be part of such an established family. But I wasn't completely powerless, though the Brennans didn't know it yet. While they saw me as the poor farm girl who'd married above her station, they had no idea about the inheritance my grandfather had left me. Grandpa Murphy had been a quiet man who'd worked his entire life as a mechanic, investing every spare dollar in farmland across 3 states. When he died during my senior year of college, he left me a portfolio of properties worth far more than anyone realized. I'd kept this information private, partly because I'd been taught not to boast about money, and partly because I wanted Daniel to love me for who I was, not what I had. I used the income from the land rentals to pay off my student loans and build a small investment account, but I lived as modestly as I always had. As the years passed and the Brennan family's treatment of me grew worse, I began to research their financial situation more carefully. What I discovered surprised me. Despite their grand lifestyle and position in the community, the Brennans were heavily leveraged. The farm expansion that Thomas was so proud of had been financed through loans that were becoming increasingly difficult to service. Commodity prices were fluctuating wildly, and several bad seasons had put serious strain on their cash flow. I also learned that much of their land wasn't actually owned outright. Thomas had mortgaged significant portions of the farm to fund Michael's modernization projects and Rebecca's wedding. The family's wealth was largely on paper, tied up in equipment and land that could be lost if they couldn't meet their financial obligations. This knowledge gave me a different perspective on their treatment of me. I began to see their cruelty not as evidence of their superiority, but as symptoms of their insecurity. They needed me to feel small because it made them feel larger. They needed someone to look down on because their own foundation was shakier than they wanted to admit. But I also realized that knowledge without action was worthless. I could understand their psychology all I wanted, but it wouldn't change my daily reality unless I did something about it. I started developing a plan, though I wasn't sure yet what form it would take. That's when I learned about the Henderson farm. The Henderson property was a beautiful 800-acre spread that bordered the Brennan farm on two sides. Old Carl Henderson had worked the land for 40 years before his children moved away to pursue other careers. When Carl died, his children decided to sell rather than maintain a property they had no interest in farming. Thomas Brennan had been trying to buy the Henderson land for months. It would have nearly doubled the size of his operation and connected several parcels that were currently separated by other properties. He'd been negotiating with the Henderson children, but his offers kept being rejected. The asking price was fair, but Thomas needed bank financing that kept falling through due to his existing debt load. I watched him grow increasingly frustrated as other potential buyers expressed interest. He'd complain at family dinners about outside investors who didn't understand farming trying to buy up prime agricultural land. Margaret would echo his sentiments, lamenting how the community was changing as longtime farming families were forced to sell to corporations or wealthy outsiders. Daniel absorbed his parents' anxiety about the Henderson farm, often coming home stressed about the potential consequences if they couldn't secure the purchase. Michael worried that losing the opportunity would set back their expansion plans by years. Even Amanda and Rebecca weighed in during family gatherings, offering suggestions and expressing concern about the family's future. None of them had any idea that I'd been quietly researching the Henderson property myself. The more I learned about the land, the more interested I became. It wasn't just the strategic value that appealed to me, though that was significant. The Henderson farm represented something more important: independence. If I owned land adjacent to the Brennan operation, I would no longer be completely dependent on their goodwill for my livelihood and housing. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I began having discreet conversations with the Henderson children through a lawyer friend I'd known since college. They were more interested in a quick, clean sale than in maximizing their profit, especially if it meant avoiding a drawn-out negotiation process. When I made an all-cash offer slightly above their asking price, they accepted immediately. The closing was scheduled for the week before Thanksgiving, giving me just enough time to finalize the details before the family gathering that would change everything. I arranged to keep the sale private, using a trust I'd established to maintain anonymity. As far as anyone knew, including Daniel, the Henderson farm had been sold to an investment group from Chicago. Thomas was devastated when he learned he'd lost the property. He'd been so confident that his family's history in the community and his relationship with the Hendersons would give him an advantage over outside bidders. The reality that someone with deeper pockets had outmaneuvered him was a blow to both his pride and his financial plans. Daniel came home that evening angrier than I'd ever seen him. He ranted about rich outsiders ruining farming communities and complained that the Henderson children had been disloyal to their father's memory. He blamed the real estate agent, the lawyers, and even the banking system for conspiring against family farmers. I listened to his tirade with a mixture of sympathy and anticipation. In just a few days, I would reveal that the rich outsider he was so angry about was sitting across the kitchen table from him. The woman he and his family had spent years treating as inferior had just outmaneuvered the mighty Thomas Brennan in the biggest land deal of the decade. But first, I had to survive Thanksgiving dinner. I had to endure one more session of their subtle cruelty and condescension, knowing all the while that I held the power to shatter their carefully constructed sense of superiority. As I prepared for what would be our last Thanksgiving as a family, I felt a calm certainty I'd never experienced before. For 8 years, I'd tried to earn their respect through submission and service. I'd absorbed their criticism and accepted their judgment, because I thought that's what love required. I was about to learn that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people the consequences of their cruelty. Sometimes respect isn't earned through sacrifice, it's demanded through strength. The Henderson farm was more than just land. It was my declaration of independence, my proof that I'd always been more than they realized, and my ticket to a future where no one would ever call me worthless again. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, I stood in the law office of Patterson & Associates in downtown Cedar Falls, signing the final documents that made me the sole owner of the Henderson farm. The papers felt heavier than they should have, weighted with 8 years of accumulated resentment and the promise of justice finally within reach. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan," said Janet Patterson, sliding the deed across her mahogany desk. "You're now the owner of some of the finest agricultural land in the county." I corrected her gently. "Actually, it's Ms. Murphy for the trust documents." Sarah Murphy. Speaking my maiden name aloud felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. Janet raised an eyebrow but made the notation without comment. Lawyers were good at keeping secrets, and I'd chosen her specifically because she had no connections to the Brennan family's usual legal circle. Everything about this transaction had been carefully planned to avoid detection until I was ready to reveal the truth. Walking back to my car, I felt the November wind cut through my coat, carrying the scent of harvested fields and the promise of winter. In 3 days, I would sit at the Brennan family table and endure their annual performance of gratitude, while they systematically reminded me of all the ways I didn't measure up to their standards. But this year will be different. This year I held cards they didn't even know existed. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual, his jaw set in the grim expression he'd worn ever since losing the Henderson property. He barely acknowledged me as he hung his coat by the door and headed straight for the refrigerator to grab a beer. "How was your day?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral while I chopped vegetables for dinner. "Same as every other day since we lost the farm," he muttered, not looking at me. "Dad's been like a bear with a sore paw. The bank's giving us grief about the expansion loan, and now with winter coming we've got equipment repairs piling up." I continued chopping, each knife stroke deliberate and precise. "Maybe losing the Henderson place isn't the end of the world. You managed fine without it before." Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with anger. "Managed fine? Sarah, do you have any idea what that land represented? It wasn't just about acreage. It was about positioning ourselves for the next generation, about staying competitive in a market that's squeezing out family farms every day. I understand it was important to your father," I said carefully, "but maybe this is an opportunity to focus on what you already have instead of always wanting more." The look Daniel gave me was one I'd seen countless times before, the expression of a man explaining simple concepts to someone he considered intellectually inferior. "You don't understand business, Sarah, you never have. This isn't about wanting more for the sake of it. It's about survival." I set down my knife and turned to face him fully. "I understand more than you think, Daniel. I have a degree in agricultural business, remember? I've been working on this farm alongside you for 8 years. Maybe the problem isn't my understanding. Maybe it's your assumption that I don't have anything valuable to contribute." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprising. It had been a long time since I'd pushed back against his dismissive attitude. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by his familiar condescension. "Having a degree and understanding the real world are two different things," he said, taking a long pull from his beer. "You've never had to make the hard decisions or take real financial risks. You've been protected by this family since the day we got married." Protected. The word hit me like a slap. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when Margaret made cutting remarks about my appearance or background. I remembered the countless hours I'd spent doing unpaid labor on the farm while being excluded from any meaningful decision-making. I considered the isolation I'd endured, cut off from my own friends and family because the Brennans demanded my complete loyalty and attention. "Protected," I repeated softly. "Is that what you call it?" Daniel was already losing interest in the conversation, scrolling through his phone while he finished his beer. "What's for dinner?" "I need to go back out and help Michael with the combine after we eat." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him exactly what his protection had cost me, how it had slowly eroded my confidence and sense of self-worth. Instead, I turned back to the stove and finished preparing a meal he would eat without gratitude before leaving me alone for the rest of the evening. But as I cooked, I found myself smiling. Daniel's casual dismissal of my capabilities, his assumption that I'd never taken real financial risks, would make Thursday's revelation all the sweeter. He had no idea that while he'd been struggling to secure bank financing for a property purchase, I'd been writing a check for the full amount without blinking. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was hanging laundry on the line behind our house when I saw Margaret's silver Cadillac pulling up the gravel drive. My mother-in-law rarely visited our little house, preferring to summon me to the main house when she needed something. Her presence here meant something was wrong. Margaret emerged from her car wearing a navy wool coat and her usual expression of barely concealed disapproval. She picked her way carefully across the gravel in her expensive heels, each step a reminder that she considered this visit beneath her dignity. "Sarah, dear," she called out, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness she used when she wanted something. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced." "Of course not, Margaret. Would you like to come in for coffee?" I gestured toward the house, though we both knew she had no intention of entering what she considered my humble dwelling. "Oh, that's not necessary. I just wanted to have a quick word about tomorrow's dinner." Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I know how much you enjoy helping with the meal preparation, but I think this year it might be best if you focus on the simpler tasks." Here it comes, I thought. Margaret's annual pre-holiday reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. "Amanda has volunteered to handle the turkey and stuffing," she continued, "and Rebecca is bringing her famous cranberry sauce recipe from that lovely restaurant in Chicago. I thought you could be in charge of the dinner rolls and perhaps setting the table." Dinner rolls and table setting, the tasks assigned to children and unwelcome guests. I'd been making Thanksgiving dinner for this family for 8 years, and Margaret was demoting me to party favor duty. "I see," I said, forcing my voice to remain level. "Any particular reason for the change?" Margaret's expression softened into what she probably thought was maternal concern. "Oh, darling, it's not personal. It's just that with Thomas so stressed about the Henderson situation, I want everything to be perfect. We can't afford any mishaps that might add to his frustration." Mishaps. In 8 years of cooking for this family, I'd never had a single culinary disaster. My pies had won ribbons at the county fair, and my pot roast was Daniel's favorite meal. But Margaret was rewriting history to support her narrative that I was incompetent and unreliable. "I understand," I said, surprising her with my calm acceptance. "I'll be happy to handle the rolls and table setting." Margaret blinked, clearly expecting more resistance. "Oh, well, good. I'm glad you're being so reasonable about this." She paused, studying my face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You seem different lately, Sarah. More, I don't know, distant perhaps?" I smiled at her, a genuine expression that seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. "Not distant, Margaret, just focused. I've been thinking a lot about family dynamics lately, about how people treat each other, and what that says about their character." Something in my tone made her straighten slightly, her social antenna picking up a signal she couldn't quite interpret. "Well," she said after a moment, "I suppose introspection is never a bad thing. Just remember that family harmony requires everyone to know their role and play it well." "Oh, I know my role," I assured her. "I'm very clear about where I stand in this family." Margaret nodded, satisfied that she'd successfully put me in my place once again. She climbed back into her Cadillac and drove away, leaving me standing in the yard with a basket of laundry and a smile that would have terrified her if she'd understood its meaning. That afternoon, I drove into town to run errands, including a stop at the Cedar Falls Community Bank. I'd been banking there since college, and while the Brennans used a larger institution in Des Moines, I preferred the personal service of a smaller bank where people knew my name. "Sarah," called out Beth Williams, the assistant manager who'd helped me set up my first checking account years ago. "How are things out at the farm?" "Busy as always," I replied, approaching her desk. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about some investment opportunities. I've been thinking about diversifying my portfolio." Beth's eyes lit up. She knew about my grandfather's inheritance, though we'd always kept the details private. "What did you have in mind?" "Agricultural land, primarily. I'm interested in properties that might complement existing farming operations in the area." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "I'm also curious about the lending practices for large farm purchases. Hypothetically speaking, what would prevent an established farming family from securing financing for a significant land acquisition?" Beth glanced around to make sure we weren't overheard, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, hypothetically, it usually comes down to debt-to-income ratios and existing obligations. If a family has already leveraged most of their assets for previous expansions, banks get nervous about additional risk. even for families with strong community ties and long farming histories. Reputation helps, but numbers don't lie, Beth said with a shrug. A farm that looks successful on the surface might be carrying more debt than people realize. Equipment loans, operating expenses, family obligations. It all adds up. I nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Appearances can be deceiving. As I left the bank, I reflected on Beth's words. The Brennan family's financial struggles weren't common knowledge, but they weren't invisible to people who understood how to read the signs. Their desperate pursuit of the Henderson farm suddenly made more sense. They weren't just seeking growth. They were trying to outrun their existing problems. That evening, Daniel came home in an even fouler mood than usual. He'd spent the day with his father going over financial projections, and the numbers apparently weren't pretty. "Dad's talking about selling some of the equipment," he said, slumping into his chair at our small kitchen table. "The new harvester we bought 3 years ago. Maybe one of the tractors. He says we need to free up some cash flow before spring planting." I set a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes in front of him, noting how he didn't thank me or even acknowledge the effort I'd put into the meal. Would that solve the problem? It would help, but it's not a real solution. We need that equipment for efficient operations. Selling it now means we'll have to lease or borrow when we need it, which costs more in the long run. Daniel stabbed at his meatloaf with unnecessary force. This whole situation is a mess. "What about asking other family members for help?" I suggested. "Rebecca and Amanda both married well. Maybe they could loan the farm some money to get through this rough patch." Daniel snorted. "Rebecca's already made it clear that her money is tied up in her husband's law practice. And Amanda's inheritance is in trust funds she can't touch. Besides, Dad would never ask for help from the daughters-in-law. It would damage his pride." But his pride allows him to treat me like hired help, I thought bitterly. The double standard was staggering. Thomas Brennan would rather sell essential equipment than admit he needed financial assistance from women he considered inferior. "What about outside investors?" I pressed. "Maybe someone local who understands farming and would be willing to partner with your family." "Like who?" Daniel's laugh was hollow. "Anyone with that kind of money around here is either already invested in their own operations or their corporate interests that would want to buy us out entirely." I took a bite of my meatloaf, chewing thoughtfully. You never know. Sometimes opportunities come from unexpected places. Daniel finally looked at me directly, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate you trying to help, Sarah. I know this stress affects you too. I just wish—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What do you wish for?" "I wish things were different. I wish we had more options, more flexibility. I wish I could give you the kind of life you deserve instead of worrying about money all the time." For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with in college. Vulnerable, honest, genuinely concerned about our future together. It almost made me reconsider my plans for Thursday's dinner. Almost, but then he continued talking, and the moment evaporated like morning fog. "Maybe after we get through this rough patch, you could think about getting a job in town. Nothing too demanding, but something that would bring in a little extra income." Beth Williams mentioned they might need part-time help at the bank. There it was. The assumption that my role was to sacrifice and adapt, while his family's problems became my responsibility to solve. Not once did it occur to him that I might already have resources that could help. Not once did he consider that his family's treatment of me might be connected to their current difficulties. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, though what I was really thinking about was how satisfying it would be to watch his face when he learned the truth about my capabilities. The next morning was Thanksgiving, and I woke before dawn to begin preparing for the day ahead. I made my assigned dinner rolls from scratch, kneading the dough with perhaps more force than necessary while I rehearsed the conversation that would change everything. As I worked, I thought about all the Thanksgivings I'd endured in this family. 8 years of sitting at their table while they shared what they were grateful for, knowing I was never included in those expressions of appreciation. 8 years of watching Margaret receive compliments on her meal while I stood in the kitchen washing dishes. 8 years of listening to Thomas lecture about the importance of family while he treated me like an outsider. Today, all of that would end. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that Amanda had once complimented, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had left me. I wanted to look respectable and calm when I delivered my bombshell. I wanted them to see exactly what kind of woman they'd been underestimating all these years. Daniel was unusually quiet as we drove to the main house, lost in his own thoughts about the family's financial problems. He had no idea that the solution to those problems was sitting beside him in the passenger seat, holding a manila envelope that contained documents that would rewrite the power dynamics of the entire Brennan family. As we pulled up to the familiar white farmhouse with its wraparound porch and autumn decorations, I felt a strange sense of peace. This would be the last time I arrived here as the subservient daughter-in-law, who accepted whatever scraps of respect they threw my way. The next time I came to this house, it would be as the woman who owned more land than Thomas Brennan could ever dream of acquiring. It would be as someone who had outmaneuvered the great Thomas Brennan in the biggest business deal of his career. It would be Sarah Murphy, the woman who had spent 8 years learning exactly how cruel people could be when they thought they held all the power, and who was about to teach them what happened when that power shifted to someone they'd never bothered to truly see. The manila envelope felt warm in my hands as I walked toward the house where my marriage would effectively end before dessert was served. The Brennan family kitchen was a symphony of controlled chaos when Daniel and I arrived at 11 that morning. Margaret stood at the center like a general commanding her troops, directing traffic with the precision of someone who'd orchestrated this production for decades. The air was thick with the competing aromas of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and the underlying tension that always accompanied family gatherings. "Sarah, perfect timing," Margaret announced without looking up from the gravy she was whisking. "The good china needs to be brought down from the dining room hutch, and the crystal glasses could use polish. Make sure you use the proper cloth. It's in the third drawer next to the sink." I nodded and headed toward the dining room, passing Amanda, who was arranging flowers in a crystal vase. She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for household help rather than family members. "Oh, Sarah," she called as I was lifting the heavy china plates from the hutch. "When you're setting the table, could you make sure my seat is positioned where I can see out the window? The light is so much better for photographs there." "Of course," I replied, carefully stacking the Brennan family's treasured Waterford china. Each plate represented more than just dinnerware. They were symbols of status, tradition, and belonging. I'd eaten off these plates for 8 years without ever truly being considered worthy of them. As I polished each piece, I listened to the conversations swirling around me. Rebecca had arrived from Chicago that morning, full of stories about her sophisticated urban life and subtle criticisms of rural Iowa's limitations. She was regaling Amanda with tales of exclusive restaurants and cultural events, while simultaneously disparaging the quaint simplicity of farm life. "I just don't understand how you stand the isolation," Rebecca was saying as she arranged cranberry sauce in cut crystal bowls. "I mean, what do you do for intellectual stimulation? The nearest decent bookstore is, 40 miles away?" Amanda laughed, a sound like silver bells with an edge of superiority. "Oh, we make our own entertainment." Last week's book club discussion of Eat, Pray, Love was surprisingly sophisticated for a rural group. And the children keep me quite busy with their violin lessons and equestrian training. Neither woman acknowledged my presence as I moved around them, setting the table with mathematical precision. Each fork, knife, and spoon had its designated place in the Brennan family hierarchy, just like each person who had occupied the chairs I was arranging. In the kitchen, I could hear Thomas holding court with Daniel and Michael, their voices carrying the weight of men discussing serious matters. They were reviewing the morning's livestock prices and complaining about federal agricultural policies, their conversation peppered with the kind of insider knowledge that reinforced their sense of importance in the farming community. "The Henderson sale still sticks in my craw," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying the bitter edge it had held for weeks. 40 years I've been dealing with Carl Henderson, 40 years of being a good neighbor, and his kids sell to some faceless Chicago investment group without even giving me a chance to match their offer. "Maybe we dodged a bullet," Michael suggested diplomatically. "Taking on that much additional debt right now might have been risky given the market volatility." Thomas's response was swift and harsh. "Don't you dare suggest we couldn't handle that purchase, son. The Brennan family has been farming this county longer than most of these newcomers have been alive. We know land value, and we know farming. What we don't know is how to compete with people who throw money around like it doesn't matter." Daniel murmured agreement, adding, It's just frustrating to lose out to someone who probably sees it as nothing more than a tax write-off. They'll probably lease it back to us at inflated rates or sell it to developers in a few years. I paused in my table setting, a water glass halfway to its designated spot. If only they knew that the faceless Chicago investment group was currently polishing their silverware and listening to every word of their bitter complaints. "Sarah!" Margaret's voice cut through my eavesdropping. "The rolls need to come out of the oven in 5 minutes. Don't let them overbrown like last year." Last year's rolls had been perfect golden brown, but Margaret never missed an opportunity to invent failures that reinforced her narrative about my incompetence. I hurried to the kitchen, noting how the conversation among the men immediately shifted to safer topics when I appeared. As I pulled the rolls from the oven, perfectly golden brown, despite Margaret's expectations, I caught a glimpse of the manila envelope I'd tucked into my purse, hanging on the back of a kitchen chair. The Henderson farm deed was inside that envelope, along with a copy of the trust documents and a letter from my attorney confirming the sale details. In a few hours, those papers would transform me from the family scapegoat into the woman who had outmaneuvered Thomas Brennan in the biggest land deal of his career. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm of subtle slights and dismissive comments. When I offered to help Margaret with the stuffing, she politely declined, saying it was too complicated for someone without her experience. When I suggested a different seasoning for the green beans, Rebecca laughed and said she'd forgotten how quaint rural cooking could be. When I complimented Amanda's flower arrangement, she responded with a detailed explanation of proper floral design principles, as if I were a student in need of education. Each interaction reinforced the family's carefully maintained hierarchy. Thomas at the top as the patriarch and landowner, Margaret as his queen, controlling social dynamics and family traditions. Michael and Daniel as the heir apparents, learning to command respect through birthright rather than achievement. Amanda and Rebecca as the sophisticated wives who elevated the family's social standing. And me at the bottom, useful for labor but excluded from decision-making, tolerated but never truly accepted. But today, their comfortable assumptions were about to be shattered. Around noon, the extended family began arriving. Margaret's sister Helen came with her husband Frank, both of them retired teachers who spent most gatherings discussing their recent travels and offering unsolicited advice about everyone else's life choices. Thomas's brother Robert arrived with his wife Nancy, bringing stories about their successful construction business and barely concealed pride about their wealth. Each arrival brought the same ritual: warm greetings for the core family members, polite acknowledgement of me as Daniel's wife, and careful positioning in the social pecking order that governed all Brennan family interactions. I was hugged briefly, asked perfunctory questions about my health, and then generally ignored as conversations shifted to topics deemed more interesting than whatever I might contribute. "Sarah's been such a help in the kitchen," Margaret announced to the assembled relatives, her tone suggesting this was both surprising and noteworthy. "She's really gotten quite good at following instructions over the years." Following instructions. Not contributing ideas, not demonstrating skill, certainly not showing leadership, just following instructions, like a well-trained employee. Helen smiled at me with the kind of condescending warmth reserved for children and mental patients. "That's wonderful, dear. It's so important for young wives to learn domestic skills. Marriage is all about finding your role and embracing it." "Sarah's always been very adaptable," added Nancy, the word carrying implications about my supposed lack of strong opinions or independent thinking. "Some women struggle with fitting into established family traditions, but she's managed quite well." I smiled and nodded, playing the role they expected while mentally rehearsing the speech that would destroy their comfortable assumptions about my adaptability and my place in their hierarchy. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation inevitably turned to the Henderson farm sale. It was clearly a raw wound for Thomas, made worse by having to discuss it in front of extended family who knew how much the purchase had meant to him. "The whole situation just proves how farming is changing," Robert observed, accepting a beer from Michael. "Used to be that local families looked out for each other, kept land in the community. Now it's all about whoever can write the biggest check." Thomas nodded grimly. "Carl Henderson and I shook hands on deals for 40 years. Never needed contracts or lawyers. Our word was our bond. But his kids, they're city people now. They don't understand community loyalty or family tradition. What do you know about the buyers? Asked Frank, leaning forward with the curiosity of someone who enjoyed gossip. Not much, Thomas admitted, his frustration evident. Some investment trust out of Chicago. Probably technology money or inherited wealth looking for tax advantages. People who see farmland as just another commodity, instead of understanding what it means to work the soil. Margaret jumped into the conversation with the authority of someone who considered herself an expert on all matters affecting the family. It's happening everywhere. Outside money coming in, driving up land prices, pushing out families who've been farming for generations. They have no respect for tradition or community values. At least they can't change the fundamental nature of farming, suggested Helen optimistically. Land is land. Whoever bought it will still need someone to work on it properly. Michael shook his head. That's the problem, Aunt Helen. They'll probably lease it to a corporate operation or sell it to developers in a few years. Small family farms can't compete with that kind of money. As I listened to their bitter speculation about the mysterious buyers who had destroyed their expansion plans, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. They were so convinced that their enemies were faceless corporations and wealthy outsiders that they couldn't imagine the possibility that one of their own had outmaneuvered them. Daniel had been unusually quiet during the conversation, staring out the window at the fields that bordered the Henderson property. When Margaret asked for his thoughts, he sighed heavily before responding. I just keep thinking about all the plans we had for that land. The efficiency improvements, the irrigation systems we could have installed, the way it would have connected our scattered parcels. Dad's right. Whoever bought it probably doesn't understand what they're sitting on. Maybe they'll be reasonable about leasing it back to us, Amanda suggested, though her tone suggested she didn't really believe it. Thomas snorted. Corporate investors aren't reasonable about anything except profit margins. They'll squeeze every penny they can out of that land, probably at our expense. The irony was delicious. Thomas Brennan, who had spent 8 years squeezing every ounce of free labor he could get from me while denying me any meaningful recognition or compensation, was complaining about being exploited by investors who understood profit margins. As the afternoon progressed toward dinner time, the family's mood grew increasingly sour. The Henderson farm sale had cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration of gratitude and family togetherness. Instead of counting their blessings, they were nursing grievances and plotting revenge against enemies who existed only in their imagination. Margaret finally called everyone to the dining room at 4 o'clock sharp, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had orchestrated this event to perfection, despite the underlying tensions. The table I had set that morning looked magnificent, with the Waterford china gleaming under the chandelier and the centerpiece Amanda had arranged providing exactly the right touch of autumn elegance. As family members found their assigned seats, I noted the familiar hierarchy reflected in the seating arrangement. Thomas at the head of the table, Margaret at the foot, Michael and Amanda to Thomas's right, Daniel and me to his left but farther from the center of power. Rebecca and her husband occupied positions of honor, while the extended family filled in the remaining chairs according to their perceived importance in the Brennan dynasty. My assigned chair faced the window that looked out over the fields stretching toward the Henderson property. As I sat down, I could see the land I now owned, 800 acres of prime Iowa farmland that represented both my Declaration of Independence and my trump card in whatever game the Brennan family thought they were playing. Thomas stood to deliver the traditional Thanksgiving blessing, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who considered himself the patriarch of something important. Lord, we thank you for the blessings you've bestowed upon our family, for the land that sustains us, the work that strengthens us, and the traditions that bind us together across generations. The prayer continued for several minutes, touching on themes of gratitude, family loyalty, and stewardship of the land. It was a beautiful sentiment, made hollow by the reality of how this family actually treated the people they claimed to cherish. As Thomas concluded the blessing and everyone murmured, Amen, I touched the manila envelope hidden in my purse one final time. In less than an hour, I would stand up from this table and shatter every assumption they had ever made about my worth, my capabilities, and my place in their carefully constructed hierarchy. The first course was served, and conversation began to flow around topics deemed appropriate for family dinner. the children's school achievements, Rebecca's latest decorating project, Amanda's volunteer work with the hospital auxiliary. I participated when directly addressed, playing my familiar role as the quiet daughter-in-law who contributed little to serious discussions. But as I listened to their self-congratulatory conversation and watched them enjoy the fruits of my morning's labor without acknowledgement, I felt a calm certainty settling over me. This performance was almost over. Soon, very soon, I would show them exactly what Sarah Catherine Murphy was capable of, when she stopped trying to earn their approval and started demanding their respect. The manila envelope seemed to pulse with possibility as I reached for my water glass and prepared to endure one final hour of their condescension before changing the course of all our lives forever. The turkey was carved with ceremonial precision as Thomas wielded the electric knife like a scepter of patriarchal authority. Each slice fell perfectly onto the antique serving platter that had belonged to his grandmother, another symbol of the Brennan family's deep roots and unshakable traditions. Around the table, family members passed dishes with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed by decades of holiday dinners. "Sarah, dear, could you fetch the cranberry sauce from the kitchen?" Margaret's request carried the subtle undertone of command that I'd learned to recognize over 8 years of marriage. Even during the meal itself, I was expected to serve rather than simply enjoy the gathering. I rose without complaint, noting how no one else was asked to interrupt their meal for errands. In the kitchen, I took a moment to steady myself, running my fingers over the manila envelope one final time. The moment of truth was approaching, and I wanted to savor these last few minutes of being underestimated. When I returned with the cranberry sauce, the conversation had shifted to Michael's latest farming innovations. He was explaining a new precision agriculture system that used GPS technology to optimize seed placement and fertilizer application. "It's the future of farming," Michael declared, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important. "We can increase yields by 15% while reducing input costs. Dad's been skeptical, but the numbers don't lie," Thomas grunted noncommittally around a bite of turkey. "Technology's fine, but there's no substitute for understanding the land. Computers can't tell you when the soil feels right or when the weather's about to turn." "Of course not," Michael agreed diplomatically. "But combining traditional knowledge with modern tools gives us the best of both worlds." Rebecca leaned forward from her position of honor near Thomas. "It sounds fascinating, Michael. In Chicago, we're seeing similar innovations in urban planning. Technology integrated with human insight to solve complex problems." The conversation continued around topics of innovation, progress, and the challenges of balancing tradition with modernization. I listened while mechanically eating Margaret's perfectly prepared meal, noting how no one asked for my thoughts despite my agricultural business degree and 8 years of hands-on farming experience. When Amanda mentioned the difficulty of finding qualified help for seasonal work, I cleared my throat softly. "Actually, I've been thinking about that problem. With the right incentive structure and housing improvements, we could probably attract more reliable workers and reduce turnover." The table fell silent for a moment, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. Daniel looked embarrassed by my contribution, while Margaret's smile grew tight with disapproval. "That's an interesting thought," Amanda said carefully, her tone suggesting it was anything but interesting. "Though I think the labor challenges are probably more complex than they appear from the outside." From the outside. Despite working alongside these seasonal employees for years, despite understanding their concerns and challenges firsthand, I was still considered an outsider looking in. Thomas wiped his mouth with his linen napkin before addressing me directly, something that happened perhaps twice per family gathering. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern for our operations, but workforce management requires experience with budgets and long-term planning. It's not something you just figure out by being friendly with the hired help." The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. 8 years of contributing to this farm's success, and he still spoke to me like a child who'd wandered into adult conversation. "You're right that it requires understanding budgets," I replied, keeping my voice level. "But sometimes an outside perspective can identify inefficiencies that become invisible when you're too close to the problem." Daniel shot me a warning look. I was violating the unspoken rule about challenging his father's authority, especially in front of extended family. But I was past caring about their rules. Margaret smoothly redirected the conversation back to safer territory. Rebecca, tell us about that charity auction you organized in Chicago. I'm always interested in fundraising innovations we might adapt for our local hospital board. As Rebecca launched into a detailed account of her social achievements, I found myself studying each face around the table. These people who had dismissed my opinions and marginalized my contributions for nearly a decade. These people who had systematically eroded my confidence while benefiting from my labor. These people who were about to learn that their assumptions about my worth had been catastrophically wrong. The meal progressed through its traditional stages, turkey and sides, followed by a brief break before dessert. During the intermission, family members scattered to different areas of the house. Some helped clear dishes, others gathered in the living room to watch football, and a few stepped outside to walk off the heavy meal. I volunteered to help with the dishes, partly out of habit, and partly because it gave me a chance to overhear conversations happening throughout the house. In the living room, Thomas was holding court with Robert and Frank. Their discussions centered on agricultural policy and its impact on family farms. The problem is that government regulations favor corporate operations over family farms, Thomas was saying, his voice carrying the weight of personal grievance. Small operators like us get squeezed out by compliance costs and bureaucratic red tape. From the kitchen, I could hear Margaret and Helen discussing the challenges of maintaining rural communities as young people move to cities for better opportunities. Their conversation was peppered with complaints about changing values and the loss of traditional family structures. Meanwhile, in the den, Michael and Daniel were reviewing financial projections on Michael's laptop, their voices low but their frustration evident. Even during Thanksgiving dinner, the family's financial pressures couldn't be completely set aside. As I dried the last of the china plates, I realized that every conversation happening in this house revolved around the same central theme: the Brennan family's struggle to maintain their position and prosperity in a changing world. They saw themselves as victims of forces beyond their control: government policies, corporate competition, cultural shifts, and mysterious outside investors who didn't understand or respect their way of life. What they couldn't see was that their biggest problem wasn't external pressure. It was their own inability to recognize and value the resources they already had. For 8 years, they'd had access to my knowledge, my insights, and my connections, but they'd been too blinded by their prejudices to utilize those assets effectively. That blindness was about to cost them dearly. Margaret called everyone back to the table for dessert around 6 o'clock. The dining room had been reset with dessert plates and coffee cups, and the sideboard groaned under the weight of multiple pies: apple, pumpkin, pecan, and Margaret's famous German chocolate cake. As family members settled back into their seats, the conversation naturally returned to the Henderson Farm situation. It was clearly the dominant concern on everyone's minds, despite attempts to focus on holiday gratitude. "I keep wondering what we could have done differently," Daniel mused, accepting a slice of apple pie from Amanda. "Maybe if we'd approached Carl directly instead of going through real estate agents." Thomas shook his head firmly. Carl wasn't the decision-maker anymore. His kids were calling the shots, and they made it clear from the start that they weren't interested in sentiment or community loyalty. They wanted the maximum dollar return, period. "Still seems strange that we never even got a chance to match the offer," Michael observed. "Usually there's some back-and-forth negotiation, especially with neighbors." Margaret's expression soured as she cut herself a small slice of pumpkin pie. "I heard from Linda Patterson at the bank that the buyers paid cash. No financing contingencies, no inspection periods, just a straightforward purchase at full asking price." "What kind of farming operation has that much liquid capital sitting around?" "The kind that's not really a farming operation," Rebecca suggested darkly. "Probably investment bankers or tech money looking for tax shelters. They'll hold it for a few years, take the agricultural exemptions, then flip it to developers when the market's right." The bitterness in their voices was palpable. They'd constructed an entire narrative about faceless corporate villains who'd stolen their birthright through superior financial resources and underhanded tactics. They needed someone to blame for their failure, and distant enemies were more comfortable than examining their own shortcomings. Frank, who'd been mostly quiet during dinner, finally spoke up. maybe it's a blessing in disguise. From what you've described about your current debt load, taking on that much additional financing might have been risky. The silence that followed Frank's observation was deafening. He'd inadvertently touched on the family's most sensitive nerve, their financial vulnerability masked by outward displays of success. Thomas's face flushed red above his collar. Our debt load is perfectly manageable for an operation of this size. The Henderson purchase would have been a strategic expansion, not a desperate gamble. Of course, Frank backpedaled quickly. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just meant that maybe this gives you time to strengthen your position before the next opportunity comes along. But the damage was done. Frank's comment had highlighted the elephant in the room. The Brennan family's precarious financial situation that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of outside competition they were complaining about. Daniel attempted to lighten the mood. At least we know the land isn't going anywhere. Whoever bought it will need it farmed properly, which means they'll probably end up leasing it back to local operators. At inflated rates, Thomas muttered. Mark my words, they'll squeeze every penny they can out of that arrangement. That's how these investment types operate. Pure profit motive with no consideration for community relationships. Helen raised her coffee cup in a gesture that might have been meant as encouragement. Well, I think you've all handled a difficult situation with remarkable grace. Not everyone would maintain such dignity in the face of unfair competition. Unfair competition. As if the Henderson children hadn't had every right to sell their inheritance to whoever offered the best terms. As if the Brennan family's 40-year relationship with Carl Henderson had created some kind of moral claim to the property. I set down my fork and reached for my purse, my fingers closing around the manila envelope. The moment had arrived. 8 years of accumulated slights and dismissals were about to be answered in a way that would shatter their comfortable assumptions forever. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of sympathetic conversation, I think there might be some misunderstandings about the Henderson farm sale. Every head at the table turned toward me, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright annoyance at being interrupted during their group therapy session about victimization and unfair treatment. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. Oh, and what misunderstandings would those be, dear? I withdrew the manila envelope from my purse and set it on the table in front of me, my hand resting protectively on top. Well, for starters, the buyers aren't a faceless corporate investment group from Chicago. Thomas leaned forward, his interest suddenly focused and intense. What do you mean? Do you know something about who bought the property? I know everything about who bought the property, I replied calmly. Because I'm the one who bought it. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 15 faces stared at me with expressions of confusion, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. Daniel was the first to find his voice. What are you talking about, Sarah? That's impossible. I opened the manila envelope and withdrew the deed, holding it up so everyone could see the official seal and legal formatting. Henderson Farm Trust, purchased November 20th for $2.3 million, cash. 800 acres of prime agricultural land, including the irrigation rights and equipment storage facilities. Margaret's face had gone pale. That's not possible. You don't have that kind of money. Actually, I do. I pulled out the trust documents and bank statements, spreading them across the table like playing cards. My grandfather left me quite a substantial inheritance when he died during my senior year of college. Farmland across 3 states, all of it generating rental income for the past 15 years. Thomas grabbed the deed with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the legal text as if he could say something different. This has to be some kind of mistake, some kind of fraud. It's no mistake, I assured him, and it's certainly not fraud. I'm worth approximately $12 million in agricultural real estate alone, not including my investment accounts and liquid assets. The words hung in the air like a bomb blast, reverberating through every assumption they'd ever made about my place in their family hierarchy. The poor farm girl who'd married above her station. The grateful daughter-in-law who should be thankful for their generosity. The simple woman who needed their guidance and protection. All of it revealed as fiction in the space of 30 seconds. Daniel's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Why didn't you ever tell me? I looked at him directly, this man I'd loved and supported, and tried so desperately to please for 8 years. When, Daniel? When would have been a good time? During one of the family dinners where your mother explained why my contributions weren't sophisticated enough? During the business meetings where your father excluded me because I couldn't possibly understand complex financial matters? Or maybe during one of our private conversations where you dismissed my opinions as naive and uninformed? The truth of my words hit the table like a physical force. 8 years of condescension and dismissal, laid bare in front of the entire extended family. Margaret tried to rally, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. This is preposterous. If what you're claiming is true, why have you been living like what? I challenged myself. Like someone who wasn't worthy of your respect? Like someone whose opinions didn't matter? Like someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of recognition you threw my way? Thomas found his voice, though it came out as a roar of rage and betrayal. You deliberately deceived us. You sat here for years pretending to be something you weren't, manipulating this family. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The manila envelope and its contents remained spread across the table like evidence in a trial where the verdict was already clear. I never pretended to be anything I wasn't, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I simply stopped trying to prove my worth to people who were determined never to see it. Rebecca found her voice, though it was pitched higher than usual with shock. But why the Henderson farm specifically? Why something so important to our family? I smiled then, an expression I'm sure none of them had ever seen on my face before. Because I wanted to show you exactly what worthless trash looks like when she stops asking for your approval and starts taking what she deserves. The phrase worthless trash hadn't been spoken yet, but I could see it forming in their minds. This was the moment when their civilized facade would crack completely, when the polite condescension would give way to raw fury and desperate attempts to regain control. This was the moment when Daniel would reveal exactly what he really thought of the woman he'd married, and I would finally have the ammunition I needed to walk away from this family forever. The Brennan family's renowned composure shattered like fine china dropped on concrete. Daniel's face cycled through shades of red I'd never seen before, while Margaret gripped her coffee cup so tightly I thought it might crack. Thomas had gone completely still, the deed clutched in his hands like evidence of his own mortality. $12 million, Amanda whispered, the number seeming to stick in her throat. You've been sitting here for 8 years with $12 million, watching us struggle, watching us worry about finances, and you said nothing? The accusation hung in the air, heavy with implications. Suddenly, my silence wasn't seen as discretion or privacy. It was a crime against family loyalty, a betrayal of the mutual support that supposedly bound us together. I wasn't aware that my personal finances were anyone else's business, I replied calmly. This family has made it very clear over the years that I'm not a full partner in decision-making. Why would I be expected to be a full partner in financial obligations? Rebecca leaned forward, her Chicago sophistication completely abandoned in favor of raw disbelief. But you could have helped. When the bank was giving Dad trouble with the expansion loans, when we had to sell equipment last spring, you just watched it happen. I watched you handle your problems the way you've always told me I should handle mine, I said, with dignity, without complaining, and without expecting anyone else to solve them for me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. The family that had spent years lecturing me about self-reliance and personal responsibility was now furious that I hadn't volunteered to solve their financial problems. Michael's voice cracked with strain. Do you have any idea what we've been going through? The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant worry about losing everything our family has built? I have some idea, I acknowledged. I've been living in this house, listening to these conversations, watching this family tear itself apart over money problems that you were too proud to admit you had. Thomas finally found his voice, though it came out as a growl of barely controlled rage. Too proud? We weren't too proud. We were trying to maintain our dignity while dealing with circumstances beyond our control. What's your excuse for sitting there like a spider, watching us struggle while you hoarded resources that could have saved this farm? The comparison to a spider was particularly rich, coming from a man who'd spent 8 years extracting free labor from me while contributing nothing to my personal growth or happiness. But I could see that rational discussion was becoming impossible. The family was spiraling into full crisis mode, their carefully constructed worldview collapsing in real time. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward and crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot, causing everyone to flinch. "This is insane. This is absolutely insane. My wife has been lying to me for our entire marriage." "I never lied about anything," I corrected. "You never asked about my finances, and after the first few years of marriage, you made it clear that my opinions and insights weren't valued. I assumed my money fell into the same category." "Don't you dare turn this around on me," Daniel snarled, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. "Don't you dare make this about hurt feelings and wounded pride. This is about fundamental honesty in a marriage. This is about partnership and trust." I almost laughed at his mention of partnership and trust. Partnership? Daniel, when was the last time you asked for my input on a major decision affecting our life together? When was the last time you defended me when your mother criticizes my cooking, or your father dismissed my suggestions? When was the last time you treated me like an equal partner instead of a domestic employee who happened to share your bed? The extended family sat frozen, their faces reflecting the horror of watching a marriage implode in real time. Helen's hand covered her mouth in shock, while Frank stared down at his dessert plate as if it might provide escape from the confrontation unfolding around him. Margaret tried to reassert control, her voice shaking with authority and desperation. "This is quite enough. Whatever personal issues you and Daniel need to work through, this is neither the time nor the place for such a display." "Actually, Margaret, this is exactly the time and place," I replied, my voice gaining strength with each word. "This family has spent 8 years making me feel small, insignificant, and grateful for whatever scraps of respect you threw my way. You've criticized my background, my education, my contributions, and my character. You've made it clear in countless ways that I was the charity case who married above her station." Thomas slammed his fist on the table, causing the china to rattle and jump. "You were a charity case. We took you in, gave you a place in this family, provided you with a lifestyle you never could have achieved on your own. And this is how you repay that generosity? By deceiving us and undermining our financial security?" The mask was finally off. After 8 years of polite condescension and subtle put-downs, Thomas was revealing his true opinion of my worth and place in the family hierarchy. I was a charity, not a family. I was a recipient of their generosity, not a contributor to their success. "Undermining your financial security?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Thomas, I've been propping up your financial security for 8 years. Who do you think has been subsidizing the household expenses while Daniel learned the farming business? Who do you think paid for the equipment repairs and seasonal labor when cash flow was tight? Who do you think has been quietly covering shortfalls so this family could maintain its precious reputation in the community?" The silence that followed was profound. I could see the gears turning in their minds as they began to calculate exactly how much of their lifestyle had been secretly funded by the woman they'd been treating as a burden. Amanda's voice came out as a whisper. "You've been paying our bills?" "Not all of them," I clarified, "but enough to make the difference between scraping by and maintaining the image this family is so desperate to project. The down payment on your house, Amanda. Orthodontics for your children. The country club membership that Rebecca insisted was essential for business networking. The new truck that Michael needed for farm operations but couldn't quite afford." Each revelation hit the table like a physical blow. These proud, self-sufficient people were learning that their comfortable lifestyle had been partially bankrolled by someone they considered beneath their notice. Rebecca found her voice, though it cracked with emotion. "Why would you do that if you didn't feel like family? If you thought we were treating you badly, why would you help us?" "Because I loved Daniel," I said simply. "Because I wanted to belong somewhere. Because I thought that if I proved myself useful enough, loyal enough, supportive enough, you might eventually see me as worthy of basic respect." Daniel's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Basic respect? Sarah, you've been running a con game on this entire family for nearly a decade. You've been manipulating our emotions, our gratitude, our sense of obligation, all while hiding the fact that you're richer than all of us combined." "I haven't manipulated anything," I shot back. "I simply responded to the role you assigned me." You wanted a grateful, subservient daughter-in-law who would work hard and ask for nothing in return. I gave you exactly what you wanted." Margaret's face had transformed into something ugly and twisted with rage. "You gave us lies. You gave us deception. You sat at our table, ate our food, slept under our roof, all while secretly laughing at us behind our backs." "I never laughed at anyone," I said firmly. "But I did learn some very important lessons about character and family values from watching how you treated someone you believed to be vulnerable and dependent." Thomas rose from his chair, his bulk casting a shadow across the table. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of this house and off this property. You're not welcome here anymore." "Thomas," I said calmly, "I own 800 acres that border your property on 2 sides. I'll be your neighbor for a very long time. You might want to reconsider the wisdom of making me your enemy." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. The Henderson farm wasn't just prime agricultural land. It controlled access to water rights and transportation routes that the Brennan operation depended on. As the new owner, I had legal powers that could make their lives very difficult if I chose to exercise them. Daniel stepped closer to me, his face contorted with fury and betrayal. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've outsmarted all of us with your secret money and your hidden agenda. But you know what you really are, Sarah?" I could see the words forming before he spoke them, could feel the final boundary being crossed from which there would be no return. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when Daniel would reveal his true character for everyone to see. "You're worthless trash," he spat, his voice carrying 8 years of accumulated resentment and frustrated superiority. "Rich trash, maybe, but still trash. You can buy all the land you want, but you'll never be anything more than a nobody from the wrong side of town who got lucky with an inheritance." The words hit the dining room like a physical force, causing gasps and shocked exclamations from the extended family. Even Margaret looked taken aback by the viciousness of her son's attack. But I felt nothing except a profound sense of relief. After 8 years of wondering, of questioning my own perceptions, of trying to convince myself that their treatment wasn't as bad as it seemed, I finally had absolute clarity. I stood slowly, gathering the documents from the table and sliding them back into the manila envelope. My movements were deliberate and calm, in stark contrast to the emotional chaos surrounding me. "Thank you, Daniel," I said quietly. "Thank you for finally saying what you really think of me. It makes what I have to do next so much easier." Daniel's anger faltered slightly, replaced by uncertainty. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled at him, an expression that held no warmth or affection. "It means that worthless trash is filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. It means that worthless trash is moving off this property this weekend and taking her financial support with her. And it means that worthless trash is about to become the wealthiest single woman in 3 counties, while you and your family figure out how to maintain your lifestyle without her subsidy." The color drained from Daniel's face as the full implications of his outburst began to dawn on him. Margaret made a strangled sound that might have been protest or grief. "You can't do this," Amanda whispered. "You can't just walk away from 8 years of marriage over one argument." "You're right," I agreed. "I can't walk away over one argument. But I can walk away over 8 years of systematic disrespect, dismissal, and emotional abuse that culminated in my husband calling me worthless trash in front of his entire family." Thomas attempted one last show of authority. "If you think you can use your money to control this family, you're mistaken. The Brennan name means something in this community. We have relationships and respect that your money can't buy." "You're absolutely right, Thomas," I acknowledged. "I can't buy the respect and relationships you've built over generations. But I can withdraw the financial support that's been helping you maintain them. We'll see how much your community's standing is worth when you can't afford to keep up appearances." I walked toward the dining room door, pausing to look back at the table full of people who had just revealed their true characters in the most spectacular way possible. "By the way," I added casually, "I'll be hiring a farm management company to handle the Henderson property. They'll probably want to discuss water rights and equipment access with whoever's farming the adjacent land. I do hope our business relationship will be more professional than our family relationship has been. The silence that followed me out of the room was deafening. Behind me, I could hear the sound of Margaret beginning to cry, and Thomas cursing under his breath. Daniel's voice rose in desperate protest, but I was already walking away from that life forever. As I drove away from the Brennan farmhouse for the last time, I rolled down the windows despite the November cold. The fresh air felt like freedom, like possibility, like the first clean breath I'd taken in 8 years. In my rearview mirror, I could see lights blazing in every window of the house, as the family that had just called me worthless trash began to calculate exactly how much my absence was going to cost them. The irony was perfect. They'd finally gotten exactly what they'd always wanted, a world without Sarah Murphy in it. They were about to discover that it was a much smaller, poorer, and lonelier world than they'd imagined. I spent that Thursday night in a hotel suite in Cedar Rapids, 40 miles from the farm that had been my prison for 8 years. The distance felt like crossing continents, putting space between myself and a life that had slowly suffocated my sense of self-worth. For the first time in nearly a decade, I fell asleep without calculating what mood Daniel might be in when he came home, without worrying about whether I'd said or done something to earn Margaret's disapproval. Friday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, both literally and figuratively. November sunlight streamed through the hotel windows as I made phone calls that would dismantle the life I'd built with the Brennan family. First, I contacted Linda Patterson at the bank to arrange the immediate closure of all joint accounts and the establishment of new ones in my name only. Then I called Janet Patterson, my attorney, to begin divorce proceedings and discuss the legal implications of my financial revelations. "Sarah," Janet said after I'd explained the previous evening's events, "I have to ask, are you certain you want to proceed this quickly? Divorce is a significant step, and emotions are running high right now." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied, watching traffic move through the city streets below. "Janet, I spent 8 years trying to earn their respect and affection. Yesterday, I learned that nothing I could have done would have ever been enough. Daniel's reaction to learning about my financial resources told me everything I needed to know about our marriage." There was a pause before Janet continued. "The prenuptial agreement you signed will complicate things somewhat." Margaret insisted on fairly strict terms regarding asset protection. I laughed, remembering Margaret's smug satisfaction when she'd presented those documents. The prenuptial agreement protects assets acquired before marriage and through inheritance. Since my grandfather's estate continued to generate income throughout my marriage, and since I can prove I kept those assets completely separate from marital property, the prenup actually works in my favor. "That's actually brilliant," Janet admitted. "Margaret inadvertently protected your wealth while trying to protect theirs." After finalizing legal strategy with Janet, I called Marcus Thompson, the farm management company I'd researched when considering the Henderson purchase. Marcus had an excellent reputation for maximizing agricultural productivity while maintaining positive relationships with neighboring operations. He agreed to meet me Saturday morning to discuss managing the Henderson property. My next call was to Emily Richardson, a real estate agent who specialized in high-end rural properties. If I was going to leave the Brennan farm, I needed to find somewhere else to live, preferably somewhere that would serve as a statement about my new independence. "I'm looking for something significant," I told Emily. "Something that reflects success and permanence, but also feels like home. Budget isn't a constraint." By noon Friday, I had assembled a team of professionals who would help me rebuild my life on my own terms. The contrast with my years as Mrs. Daniel Brennan was stark. Suddenly, people were eager to take my calls, respectful of my time, and interested in my opinions about everything from investment strategies to interior design preferences. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since Thursday night with calls and texts from various Brennan family members. I'd ignored them all, but curiosity finally got the better of me. The messages painted a picture of a family in complete chaos. Daniel's texts started apologetic. "Sarah, we need to talk. I was upset and said things I didn't mean. Please come home so we can work this out." By Friday afternoon, they'd shifted to angry. "You can't just disappear without explanation. We have 8 years of marriage to consider. His final message that evening was desperate. I know I messed up, but running away won't solve anything. Please call me. Margaret's voicemails were masterpieces of manipulation disguised as concern. Sarah, dear, I know yesterday was emotional for everyone. Thomas and I are deeply troubled by this misunderstanding. Surely we can sit down like civilized people and work through these issues. Her second message revealed more anxiety. I've spoken to several family members, and everyone agrees that hasty decisions made in anger often lead to regret. Perhaps some time apart will help everyone gain perspective. Even Rebecca had texted from Chicago. Sarah, I don't know what happened after I left last night, but Daniel sounds devastated. Whatever he said or did, I'm sure he didn't mean it. Family means working through problems together. The unanimity of their response was fascinating. Without exception, every Brennan family member was treating the situation as a temporary emotional crisis that could be resolved through discussion and compromise. None of them seemed to grasp that the fundamental power dynamic of our relationship had shifted permanently. Saturday morning brought my meeting with Marcus Thompson at the Henderson farm. We met at the property line where Henderson land bordered Brennan acreage, standing on soil that represented both my Declaration of Independence and my strategic advantage in whatever negotiations might follow. Marcus was a lean man in his 50s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life working with the land. He walked the property boundaries with the confidence of an expert, pointing out drainage issues, soil conditions, and infrastructure improvements that could maximize productivity. This is beautiful farmland, he observed, kneeling to examine the soil composition. Carl Henderson was a good steward. The previous management kept it in excellent condition. What's your assessment of the neighboring operation? I asked, gesturing toward the Brennan fields visible across the fence line. Marcus was diplomatic but honest. The Brennans run a solid operation, but they've been struggling with cash flow issues for several years. They've deferred some maintenance and improvements that are starting to show. Nothing catastrophic, but definitely signs of financial pressure. We spent 2 hours discussing management strategies, lease arrangements, and the potential for joint operations with neighboring farms. Marcus's expertise was impressive, and his approach balanced profitability with environmental stewardship in ways that appealed to my long-term vision for the property. There's one issue we should discuss, Marcus said as we concluded our tour. Water rights. The Henderson property controls access to Deer Creek, which provides irrigation for several downstream operations. The previous owner had informal agreements with neighbors, but you'll want to formalize those arrangements. I smiled at the implications. The Brennan farm depended on Deer Creek water for a significant portion of their irrigation needs. Their access had been guaranteed by Carl Henderson's neighborly generosity, but that arrangement had died with Carl. As the new owner, I had the legal right to modify or terminate water access agreements. I'll want to review all existing arrangements, I told Marcus. We should establish fair market rates for water usage and access fees. Sunday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my hotel. I was reviewing property listings from Emily Richardson when the front desk called to announce that Daniel was in the lobby asking to see me. Part of me wanted to refuse, but curiosity about his state of mind won out. Daniel looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes carried the bloodshot look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He stood when I entered the lobby, his posture uncertain and defeated. Sarah, he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Thank you for seeing me. We found a quiet corner of the hotel's restaurant, away from other guests. Daniel ordered coffee with shaking hands while I studied this man I'd been married to for 8 years. Without his usual confidence and charm, he seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I've been thinking about everything that happened Thursday, he began, staring into his coffee cup. About what I said, about how we got to this point. Sarah, I know I hurt you deeply, and I'm sorry. Which part are you sorry for, Daniel? I asked calmly. Calling me worthless trash? Dismissing my contributions to your family's success? Or not recognizing my worth until you discovered I had money? He flinched at each item in my list. All of it. Everything. I was angry and shocked and feeling betrayed, but that's no excuse for what I said. You didn't deserve that, no matter how confused and hurt I was feeling. You're right, I agreed. I didn't deserve that. But I also didn't deserve 8 years of being treated like a second-class member of your family. Daniel's composure cracked slightly. Come on, Sarah. It wasn't that bad. My family, they're traditional, maybe a little old-fashioned, but they accepted you. You were part of everything we did. The casual dismissal of my experience was exactly what I'd expected. Even now, faced with the collapse of his marriage, Daniel couldn't acknowledge the systematic way his family had marginalized and diminished me. Daniel, I said quietly, your mother assigned me dinner roles and table setting for Thanksgiving dinner after 8 years of cooking for your family. Your father excluded me from conversations about farming despite my agricultural business degree. You corrected my grammar at family gatherings and took credit for my ideas when talking to your friends. If that's your definition of acceptance, we have very different standards. But you never said anything, he protested. You never told me you were unhappy. If I'd known how you felt— I did tell you, I interrupted. Repeatedly. You dismissed my concerns as oversensitivity. You told me I was misunderstanding your family's intentions. You made me feel like my perceptions were wrong and my expectations were unreasonable. Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of accumulated evidence settling on his shoulders. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, he was being forced to examine his behavior from someone else's perspective. The money, he said finally. Why didn't you tell me about the money? Because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I had, I replied honestly. And because your family made it clear from the beginning that they saw me as someone who should be grateful for whatever they gave me. I was afraid that knowing about my inheritance would change our dynamic in ways I wasn't ready to handle. It would have changed everything, Daniel admitted. Dad's been killing himself trying to keep the farm profitable, and you could have solved our problems with a phone call. We could have expanded years ago, modernized our operations, and secured our future. Our future, I repeated. Not my future, Daniel. Our future. Even now, you're thinking about what my money could have done for your family's plans, not about what your family's treatment did to my sense of self-worth. The accusation hung between us, impossible to deny. Daniel's first instinct upon learning about my wealth had been to calculate its value to his family's ambitions, not to apologize for making me feel worthless despite my resources. So what happens now? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Now we get divorced, I said matter-of-factly. You go back to your family and figure out how to maintain your lifestyle without my financial support. I move forward with my life as someone who owns more farmland than your father ever dreamed of acquiring. Daniel's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. You really did outsmart all of us, didn't you? The poor farm girl we all felt sorry for turned out to be richer than any of us. I never tried to outsmart anyone, I corrected. I just stopped trying to make myself smaller to fit into the space your family carved out for me. As I watched Daniel process the finality of our situation, I felt a surprising absence of satisfaction. I'd expected to feel triumphant in this moment, vindicated by his obvious regret and desperation. Instead, I felt only sadness for the 8 years we'd wasted, and the relationship we might have had if he'd been capable of seeing me as an equal partner. I do love you, Sarah, he said quietly. I know I didn't show it the way I should have, but I do love you. I know you do, I replied. But Daniel, you love the idea of me that exists in your head. You love the supportive wife who doesn't challenge your assumptions or threaten your sense of superiority. You've never been interested in loving the real me, because you've never bothered to figure out who that person actually is. Daniel left the hotel that evening understanding that his marriage was over. As I watched him drive away, I felt the last chains of my old life falling away. The woman who had sat silently through 8 years of condescension and disrespect was gone forever. Monday morning brought a flurry of activity as my team of professionals began dismantling my old life and constructing my new one. Janet filed divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences, while Linda Patterson completed the financial arrangements that would secure my independence. Emily Richardson scheduled property viewings for the following week, focusing on estates that would serve as appropriate headquarters for my expanding agricultural empire. By Tuesday, the news of my divorce filing had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Small towns thrived on gossip, and the revelation that the quiet Brennan daughter-in-law was actually a multimillionaire landowner provided entertainment for weeks. The community's reaction was mixed, but fascinating to observe. Some people who had barely acknowledged my existence for years suddenly remembered shared conversations and mutual interests. Others seemed personally offended by my deception, as if my privacy about personal finances had somehow victimized them. But the most interesting reactions came from the farming community itself. News that I'd purchased the Henderson farm had traveled quickly through agricultural circles, and my phone began ringing with calls from other landowners interested in discussing business opportunities. Suddenly, my opinions about crop rotation and soil management were considered worth hearing. Wednesday brought the first formal contact from the Brennan family since my revelation. Thomas's attorney called Janet to discuss water rights and access agreements related to the Henderson property. The call was professional and businesslike, with no mention of family relationships or personal feelings. The message was clear. The Brennans understood that our relationship had shifted from personal to purely transactional. They needed access to Deer Creek water for their farming operations, and I controlled that access. Everything else, 8 years of marriage, shared holidays, family connections, had been reduced to irrelevant history. I instructed Janet to schedule a meeting for the following week to discuss terms. It would be the first time I'd faced the Brennan family since walking out of their Thanksgiving dinner, but this time I would be sitting across the negotiating table as an equal partner with something they desperately needed. The transformation was complete. Sarah Murphy, the woman who had been called worthless trash 4 days earlier, was about to become the most powerful person in the room, where her former family would have to ask politely for what they needed to survive. The irony was perfect, and justice had never tasted sweeter. The conference room at Patterson & Associates had hosted thousands of business meetings over the years, but none quite like the one scheduled for Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. I arrived early, wanting to observe the Brennan family's entrance from a position of established authority rather than appearing to be the supplicant seeking their attention. Janet had arranged the seating strategically. I would sit at the head of the polished oak table, with my legal and agricultural teams flanked on either side. The Brennans would occupy chairs along one side, literally and figuratively on the opposite side of the table from me. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but then again, subtlety had never been the Brennan family's strength. At precisely 9 o'clock, they filed into the conference room like mourners at a funeral. Thomas entered first, his usual commanding presence diminished by the circumstances that had forced him to request this meeting. Margaret followed, her perfectly applied makeup unable to completely disguise the strain of the past week. Daniel came next, looking marginally better than he had during our hotel encounter, but still carrying the haunted expression of a man whose world had been fundamentally altered. Michael brought up the rear, his engineer's mind probably already calculating the financial implications of whatever terms I might propose. The transformation in their demeanor was immediately apparent. Gone was the casual dismissal I'd endured for 8 years. In its place was careful politeness, the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for people whose cooperation you desperately needed. "Sarah," Thomas began, his voice carrying none of its usual condescension, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know the circumstances are unusual." "Not unusual at all," I replied calmly. "Business meetings between neighboring landowners happen every day. The only unusual aspect is that it took so long for us to have this conversation. The barb hit its target. For 8 years, I'd lived on property adjacent to the Henderson farm, understanding its strategic value and potential impact on Brennan operations. But I'd never been considered worthy of inclusion in discussions about land use, water rights, or agricultural planning. Janet opened a folder containing the legal documents that would govern our future relationship. "Mrs. Brennan," she began, then corrected herself with a slight smile. "Ms. Murphy has asked me to outline the current situation regarding water access and property easements." The use of my maiden name wasn't accidental. It served as a reminder that the woman sitting across from them was no longer bound by marriage or family loyalty to consider their interests above her own. "The Henderson property controls primary access to Deer Creek," Janet continued, "which provides irrigation water to approximately 400 acres of Brennan farmland. The previous owner, Carl Henderson, maintained informal agreements with neighboring properties regarding water usage. Those agreements died with Mr. Henderson. Thomas's jaw tightened as the legal reality settled in. For decades, his farming operation had depended on Carl Henderson's neighborly generosity for water access. That dependency had seemed secure, because both men shared the unspoken understanding that farming neighbors looked out for each other. But Sarah Murphy wasn't bound by those traditional courtesies. Margaret attempted to bridge the gap with an appeal to history and sentiment. "Sarah dear, surely we can work out some arrangement that honors the spirit of Carl's agreements. Our families have been neighbors for years. There's no need for formal contracts when we trust each other." "Trust," I repeated, savoring the irony. "Margaret, I spent 8 years trusting this family to treat me with basic respect and consideration. That trust proved to be misplaced. I think formal contracts are exactly what we need." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken recriminations. Each person at the table understood that we'd moved beyond the realm of family relationships into pure business negotiation. The loving daughter-in-law who had absorbed their criticism without complaint was gone, replaced by a landowner who held cards they desperately needed. Marcus Thompson cleared his throat and opened his agricultural assessment folder. From a practical standpoint, the water access issue affects seasonal irrigation during dry periods. The Brennan operation currently utilizes approximately 2.3 million gallons annually from Deer Creek, primarily during July and August, when rainfall is typically insufficient for optimal crop yields. The specificity of the numbers sent a clear message. This wasn't a casual conversation between neighbors. It was a formal business negotiation with documented usage patterns and measured financial implications. Michael leaned forward, his engineer's mind engaging with the technical aspects. "What kind of terms are we discussing? Annual fees, per gallon charges, seasonal agreements?" "That depends," I replied, "on what the Brennan family is prepared to offer in exchange for continued water access." Thomas's face flushed with controlled anger. "This is extortion. Carl Henderson never charged us a penny for water access in 40 years. You're trying to profit from basic neighborly cooperation." "Thomas," I said quietly, "neighborly cooperation is a two-way street. For 8 years, I've contributed to this family's success through my labor, my financial support, and my loyal silence about your business difficulties. I've been cooperative to the point of invisibility. Now you want to lecture me about the importance of neighborly cooperation?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room understood that the current situation was a direct result of how the Brennan family had chosen to treat their neighbor for the better part of a decade. Daniel finally found his voice, though it lacked his usual confidence. "Sarah, we know we made mistakes. We know we didn't always treat you the way we should have. But punishing the entire farming operation seems extreme." "I'm not punishing anyone," I corrected. "I'm simply conducting business according to the same principles this family taught me. Self-reliance, market-based pricing, and formal agreements instead of relying on the goodwill of people who might not always have your best interests at heart." Janet slid a document across the table toward Thomas. "Ms. Murphy's initial proposal for water access rights? The terms are based on current market rates for agricultural water usage in comparable situations." Thomas picked up the document, his eyes scanning the terms with growing dismay. I watched his expression shift from annoyance to shock as he absorbed the financial implications. $50,000 annually? He choked out. Plus usage fees based on actual consumption? This is robbery. Actually, Marcus interjected calmly, those rates are slightly below market value for water rights in Iowa. Ms. Murphy is offering a family discount. The phrase family discount was deliberately provocative. After being told she was worthless trash by her husband, Sarah was still offering financial consideration to the family that had rejected her. Margaret tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wounded tone she'd perfected over years of manipulating family dynamics. "Sarah, I know we've had our differences, but surely you can't intend to bankrupt the family that raised your husband. Daniel grew up on this farm. It's his heritage, his birthright." "Daniel's birthright," I mused. "Margaret, remind me again what my role was supposed to be in preserving Daniel's birthright?" Was I the equal partner whose contributions were valued and acknowledged? Or was I the grateful beneficiary who was expected to sacrifice everything for the greater good of Brennan family prosperity? Margaret's social mask slipped, revealing the calculation underneath. You were family. Family members support each other. I was cheap labor with benefits, I corrected. Family members don't call each other worthless trash when they discover inconvenient truths. Daniel winced at the reminder of his Thanksgiving outburst. Sarah, I apologized for that. I was angry and shocked, and I said something terrible that I didn't mean. Oh, but you did mean it, I replied gently. Daniel, that's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. For 8 years, you've been thinking of me as worthless trash who got lucky by marrying into a better class of people. You just finally said it out loud. The psychological warfare was deliberate and devastating. I wanted each member of the Brennan family to understand that their current predicament was a direct result of their own choices and attitudes. Thomas slammed the water rights proposal onto the table. This is ridiculous. We'll drill our own wells before we pay these outrageous fees. Marcus consulted his geological survey reports. Actually, Mr. Brennan, the water table in this area makes well drilling problematic. The initial investment would be substantial, and the ongoing costs would likely exceed the proposed access fees. Plus, environmental regulations for new agricultural wells have become quite stringent. The technical explanation was delivered with professional neutrality, but its implications were clear. The Brennan family's options were limited, and their negotiating position was weak. I let the silence stretch while they absorbed the reality of their situation. After 8 years of holding all the cards in our relationship, they were discovering what it felt like to be dependent on someone else's goodwill. However, I continued eventually, I'm prepared to offer an alternative arrangement that might be more palatable. Thomas looked up sharply, hope flickering in his eyes. What kind of alternative? A partnership, I said simply. The Henderson property and the Brennan farm have complementary strengths. Combined operations could achieve efficiencies that neither could accomplish independently. Michael's engineering mind immediately engaged with the possibilities. What kind of partnership structure? I opened my own folder, revealing detailed agricultural projections and business plans I'd been developing with Marcus's assistance. Joint equipment purchases, shared seasonal labor, coordinated crop rotations, and integrated water management. The Henderson property provides capital resources, the Brennan farm provides operational expertise. The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of bleeding the Brennan family dry through water access fees, I was offering them a path to prosperity that acknowledged their genuine contributions while establishing my financial superiority. Thomas studied the partnership documents with growing amazement. These projections, if these numbers are accurate, we're talking about a 30% increase in overall productivity. The numbers are conservative, Marcus confirmed. The synergies between the two operations could yield even better results. Margaret's voice carried a note of suspicion. What's the catch? What do you get out of this arrangement? Control, I replied without hesitation. I become the majority partner in a joint venture that bears my name. Brennan Farms becomes a subsidiary of Murphy Agricultural Enterprises. All major decisions require my approval. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. I was offering them prosperity and security, but only if they acknowledged my authority over operations that had been their family's domain for generations. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. You want us to work for you? I want you to work with me, I corrected. But yes, the hierarchy would be clear. I would be the senior partner, the primary decision maker, the person whose vision drives the operation forward. It was poetic justice of the most elegant kind. The family that had spent 8 years treating me as subordinate help was being offered the chance to literally become my employees. Thomas's pride warred with his financial desperation. And if we refuse, if we choose to maintain our independence, then you pay market rates for water access and manage your financial difficulties, however you see fit. I replied calmly. I'll operate the Henderson property independently and wish you luck with your challenges. The threat was understated but unmistakable. Without the partnership, the Brennan family would face slowly mounting costs and declining competitiveness while watching their neighbor prosper with superior resources. Margaret made one final attempt to appeal to sentiment over business logic. Sarah, please. This farm has been in Thomas's family for 4 generations. You can't seriously expect him to subordinate himself to someone he once called worthless trash? I finished gently. Margaret, I'm offering your family a path to prosperity that preserves their connection to the land they love. The only cost is acknowledging that the woman they've spent 8 years dismissing actually has valuable contributions to make. The symmetry was perfect. For 8 years I'd been told my ideas weren't sophisticated enough, my background wasn't impressive enough, my contributions weren't important enough to warrant equal treatment. Now I was offering them the chance to discover exactly how valuable those dismissed contributions could be. Thomas stared at the partnership proposal for several long minutes, the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "The name," he said quietly. "Murphy Agricultural Enterprises. That was your grandfather's name, wasn't it?" "Yes," I confirmed. "The man who taught me that land ownership isn't just about having your name on a deed. It's about having the vision and resources to make that land productive for generations to come." Daniel laughed bitterly. "So this was always the plan? Marry into the family, wait for the right opportunity, then take over the operation?" "Daniel," I said with infinite patience, "if I'd wanted to take over your family's farm, I could have bought it outright years ago. I didn't need to marry you to access farmland. I married you because I loved you and wanted to build a life together." The past tense wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The woman who had loved Daniel Brennan enough to subsidize his family's lifestyle was speaking about those feelings as finished history. "But since you've made it clear that our marriage is over," I continued, "I'm simply offering your family the best possible terms for our future business relationship." Thomas closed the partnership proposal folder with finality. "We'll need time to discuss this privately. As a family." "Of course," I agreed. "Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open until the end of the month." The deadline was deliberately generous but firm. I was giving them 3 weeks to choose between pride and prosperity, between maintaining their traditional hierarchy and adapting to new realities. As the Brennan family gathered their documents and prepared to leave, Margaret made one final attempt to bridge the personal and professional divide. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion for perhaps the first time in our relationship, "I know we made mistakes. I know we didn't always appreciate your contributions the way we should have. Is there any chance, any possibility that we could find a way to rebuild our family relationships?" I considered her question carefully, studying the faces of people who had shaped 8 years of my life. There was genuine regret in Margaret's expression, desperation in Thomas's posture, and something that might have been love in Daniel's eyes. "Margaret," I said finally, "I've learned that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, but new relationships can be constructed on different foundations. If your family chooses the partnership, we'll have many opportunities to discover what kind of working relationship we can build together." It was the most generous response I could offer. The personal relationships of the past were finished, but professional relationships built on mutual respect and clear boundaries were possible. As they filed out of the conference room, Daniel lingered for a moment. "Sarah, I know I destroyed what we had. I know there's no going back, but I want you to know that losing you is the biggest mistake of my life." "I know," I replied simply. "But Daniel, the biggest mistake wasn't calling me worthless trash. The biggest mistake was believing it." After they left, I sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 1 week, I had transformed from the dismissed daughter-in-law to the person whose approval the Brennan family desperately needed. Janet returned to gather her files, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction mixed with personal admiration. "That was masterfully handled. You gave them a way to save face while establishing your authority clearly." "They're good people who made bad choices," I replied. "The partnership offer is genuine. If they accept it, everyone benefits. And if they don't..." I smiled, thinking about the other agricultural properties I'd been investigating, the expansion possibilities that stretched across 3 counties. Then Murphy Agricultural Enterprises grows in different directions. 3 weeks later, Thomas Brennan called to accept the partnership proposal. The signing ceremony was held at the Henderson property, on land that had once been beyond his reach but was now part of an operation he helped manage under my leadership. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, Murphy Agricultural Enterprises had become one of the most successful farming operations in central Iowa. The Brennan family had maintained their connection to the land they loved, while discovering that prosperity was possible when resources were managed by someone who understood both agriculture and business. Daniel and I finalized our divorce with dignity and mutual respect. He eventually remarried, choosing a woman whose background satisfied his family's social expectations. They seemed happy together, and I felt no bitterness about their success. Margaret and Thomas adapted to their new roles with surprising grace. Having a boss who actually listened to their insights and valued their experience was apparently a novel experience that they found more satisfying than they'd expected. I bought a magnificent estate on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, a place that reflected both my agricultural roots and my financial success. The house was featured in Better Homes and Gardens, with an article titled "Iowa Entrepreneur Combines Farming Heritage with Modern Business Vision." But the real satisfaction came from smaller moments. The seasonal workers who now received competitive wages and excellent benefits. The local agricultural college that benefited from my scholarship fund for young women studying farm management. The community programs that my foundation supported. Most of all, I treasured the respect I received from other farmers and business leaders who sought my advice on everything from crop rotation to investment strategies. These people saw me as Sarah Murphy, successful entrepreneur and agricultural innovator, not as someone who had married above her station or gotten lucky with an inheritance. On the first anniversary of that Thanksgiving dinner, I hosted my own gathering at my new home. The guest list included successful women from across the region, entrepreneurs, farmers, professionals who had built their own paths to prosperity. We raised our glasses not in gratitude for what others had given us, but in celebration of what we had achieved through our own vision and determination. As I looked around the table at these remarkable women, I remembered the moment when Daniel had called me worthless trash. That phrase had been intended to diminish and dismiss me, to put me back in what he considered my proper place. Instead, it had liberated me from the need to seek approval from people who were determined never to grant it. It has freed me to discover my own worth and demand that others recognize it as well. The woman who had sat silently through years of condescension was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that true worth isn't measured by others' approval, but by your own willingness to stand up and claim the respect you deserve. The Brennan family had called me worthless trash and learned, too late, that they had thrown away something precious. But I had learned something far more valuable, that knowing your own worth is the greatest power of all. And unlike the land that connected us, that knowledge could never be taken away. The months following the partnership agreement brought unexpected revelations about the true state of Brennan family finances. As the majority partner, I now had access to their complete financial records, and what I discovered was both alarming and enlightening. The family's debt was even more extensive than I'd suspected, with equipment loans, operating credit lines, and family obligations, creating a complex web of financial vulnerability. More interesting were the discoveries about Thomas's business practices over the years. The traditional farming wisdom he'd used to justify excluding me from financial discussions had actually masked some questionable decisions. Crop insurance claims that pushed ethical boundaries, tax strategies that skirted legal requirements, and vendor relationships that prioritized personal connections over competitive pricing had all contributed to the operation's declining profitability. Marcus Thompson brought these issues to my attention during our monthly review meetings, his professional concern evident as he outlined the patterns he'd identified. "Sarah, I need to be direct about something," he said during our February meeting, snow falling outside the conference room windows of my new estate. "The Brennan operation has been running on borrowed time for longer than anyone realized. Without your capital injection and management oversight, they would have been forced into bankruptcy within 18 months. The revelation reframed everything I'd experienced during my marriage. The family's increasing stress about finances, their desperate pursuit of the Henderson farm, their growing hostility toward my suggestions. All of it made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of impending financial collapse. Thomas had been fighting to save a sinking ship while simultaneously rejecting the life preserver I'd been offering through my insights and suggestions. His pride hadn't just cost him respect. It had nearly cost him everything his family had built over 4 generations. But the partnership was already showing remarkable results. By consolidating equipment purchases, coordinating planting schedules, and implementing the precision agriculture technologies that Michael had long advocated, we'd reduced operating costs by 22% while increasing overall productivity. The financial projections I'd presented during our negotiation meeting were proving conservative. Actual results were exceeding expectations across every metric. The transformation wasn't just financial. The working atmosphere on both properties had improved dramatically once clear authority structures were established. Seasonal workers received consistent supervision, equipment maintenance followed systematic schedules, and long-term planning replaced the crisis management that had characterized previous operations. Daniel adapted to the new structure with surprising professionalism. Whatever personal feelings he harbored about our changed relationship, he performed his assigned duties with competence and reliability. During our monthly operational meetings, he contributed valuable insights about soil conditions and weather patterns, his practical knowledge combining effectively with the data-driven approaches I favored. Margaret found her own niche within the reorganized operation, taking charge of community relations and regulatory compliance. Her social connections, previously used primarily for maintaining family status, became valuable business assets as she navigated county agricultural boards and state environmental agencies. Michael flourished under the new management structure, finally given the budget and authority to implement the technological improvements he'd been advocating for years. His precision agriculture systems, now properly funded and integrated across both properties, became a model that neighboring farms began studying and adopting. The ripple effects extended beyond our immediate operation. Other farming families in the region began approaching me with requests for consultation, partnership discussions, and investment opportunities. Word had spread through agricultural circles about the dramatic turnaround at Murphy Agricultural Enterprises, and my reputation as someone who could combine traditional farming knowledge with modern business practices attracted attention from across the Midwest. By spring, I was fielding calls from agricultural extension services, farming magazines, and business schools interested in documenting our partnership model. The woman who had once been excluded from conversations about farming was now being asked to speak at conferences and symposiums about innovative approaches to agricultural management. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same insights and perspectives that the Brennan family had dismissed as naive and uninformed were now being sought after by industry professionals who understood their value. Emily Richardson, my real estate agent, kept me informed about property opportunities throughout the region. The success of the Henderson acquisition had established my credibility as a serious agricultural investor, and other landowners began approaching me with offers before their properties hit the general market. "You've become the person everyone wants to sell to," Emily explained during one of our quarterly meetings. "Farmers know you'll maintain agricultural use, preserve family legacies, and bring professional management that protects long-term value. You're not seen as a corporate raider or outside exploiter." By summer, Murphy Agricultural Enterprises controlled over 3,000 acres across 4 counties, making it one of the largest family-owned farming operations in central Iowa. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: identify underperforming properties with good underlying assets, purchase at fair market value, implement professional management practices, and offer former owners opportunities to remain involved as employees or consultants. The business model wasn't just successful, it was transformative for the entire regional agricultural community. Small family farms that might have been forced into bankruptcy found new life as components of a larger, more efficient operation. Experienced farmers who lacked capital for modernization gained access to cutting-edge equipment and techniques. Young people who might have left farming for urban careers discovered opportunities for advancement within an operation that valued innovation and education. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my transformation was the change in how community members interacted with me. The woman who had once been introduced as Daniel's wife was now known throughout the region as Sarah Murphy, the entrepreneur who revolutionized farming in central Iowa. Local banking executives sought my advice on agricultural lending practices. County commissioners consulted me about rural development initiatives. State legislators requested my input on agricultural policy proposals. The governor appointed me to serve on the Iowa Agricultural Advisory Board, recognizing my unique perspective as someone who combined practical farming experience with sophisticated business acumen. The appointment ceremony took place at the state capitol in Des Moines, with local media covering the event as an example of Iowa's entrepreneurial spirit. Standing in the rotunda where agricultural heritage was celebrated alongside technological innovation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I had been sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner table, being assigned the task of arranging dinner rolls while men discussed agricultural policy that would affect my life but not my opinions. Now I was helping shape agricultural policy for an entire state, my recommendations carrying weight in conversations that would determine the future of farming for generations to come. The personal transformation was equally dramatic. The quiet, accommodating woman who had spent 8 years trying to earn approval from people determined never to grant it, had been replaced by someone who commanded respect through competence and achievement. I no longer sought validation from others because I had learned to validate myself through measurable success and meaningful contribution. Dating had been an interesting adjustment. Men who approached me now did so with full knowledge of my financial resources and professional accomplishments. The power dynamics were completely different from my relationship with Daniel, where I had hidden my assets to avoid complicating our emotional connection. I found myself attracted to people who saw my success as appealing rather than threatening, who wanted to build something together rather than compete for dominance. The relationships I developed were partnerships between equals, based on mutual respect and shared ambitions rather than traditional gender roles or financial dependency. Dr. James Crawford, a veterinarian who served several of my farming operations, became a particularly close companion. His expertise in large animal medicine complemented my agricultural interests, and his respect for my business acumen created a foundation for genuine intellectual partnership. We often spent evenings discussing everything from livestock breeding programs to sustainable farming practices, conversations that would have been impossible with someone who viewed my opinions as inferior or uninformed. "What I admire about you," James told me during a dinner at my estate, "is how you've taken experiences that could have made you bitter and used them to build something positive. You could have destroyed the Brennan family financially, but instead, you created a structure that made everyone more successful." His observation highlighted something I'd been thinking about frequently. The power I now held could have been used for revenge in a dozen different ways. I could have foreclosed on Brennan debts, driven them into bankruptcy, or simply watched them fail while I prospered. Instead, I had chosen a path that demonstrated strength through constructive leadership rather than destructive retaliation. The choice hadn't been motivated by forgiveness or residual affection for the family that had mistreated me. It had been motivated by a clear-eyed understanding that building something positive was more satisfying and more profitable than tearing something down. As autumn arrived again, marking nearly a year since the Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything, I found myself preparing for another holiday season with very different emotions. Instead of dreading family gatherings where I would be marginalized and criticized, I was planning celebrations where I would be the host, setting the tone and controlling the guest list. My first Thanksgiving as Sarah Murphy, independent entrepreneur, would be held at my estate for a carefully chosen group of people who had supported my journey or contributed to my success. Janet Patterson would be there, along with Marcus Thompson and Emily Richardson. James Crawford would join us, along with several other professionals who had become both colleagues and friends. The contrast with previous years was stark. Instead of being assigned menial tasks while others made important decisions, I would be the person orchestrating every aspect of the celebration. Instead of listening to conversations about farming while being excluded from participating, I would be leading discussions about agricultural innovation and rural development. But I also extended an invitation to Daniel, Margaret, and Thomas, not as family members, but as business partners whose contributions to Murphy Agricultural Enterprises deserved recognition. The invitation was professional rather than personal, acknowledging our working relationship while maintaining clear boundaries about the nature of our connection. Their acceptance of the invitation spoke volumes about how completely our dynamics had shifted. The people who had once expected my gratitude for including me in their celebrations were now grateful to be included in mine. The evening itself was everything I had imagined it could be. Conversations flowed around topics I was passionate about, with participants who valued my insights and perspectives. The meal was prepared by professional caterers I had hired, eliminating the domestic labor that had previously defined my role at family gatherings. When it came time for expressions of gratitude, I spoke about the journey that had brought me to this moment, not dwelling on past grievances, but acknowledging how challenges had become opportunities for growth and transformation. "I'm grateful for the experiences that taught me to value myself," I said, raising my glass to the assembled group. "I'm grateful for the people who challenged me to become stronger and more capable. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to build something meaningful that extends beyond my own success." Daniel's response was particularly poignant. "I'm grateful for Sarah's leadership of our joint operation," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "And I'm grateful for the professional relationship we've built, which has taught me things about farming and business that I never could have learned otherwise." It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said about our relationship. The personal connection had been damaged beyond repair, but something more valuable had emerged in its place, a working partnership based on mutual benefit and clear expectations. As the evening concluded and guests began departing, Thomas approached me privately for a conversation that had been months in the making. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated regret, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond business relationships. The way my family treated you during your marriage was inexcusable. We were so focused on maintaining our own sense of importance that we couldn't see the value of what you brought to our lives." The apology was more comprehensive and heartfelt than anything I'd received from any Brennan family member. But more importantly, it came from someone who now understood exactly what he had lost through his inability to recognize my worth when it mattered. "Thomas," I replied, "I've learned that apologies mean less than changed behavior. The fact that you're capable of working respectfully with me now tells me more about your character than any words could." That conversation marked the final transformation in our relationship. The patriarchal figure who had once dismissed my contributions as irrelevant was now someone who sought my approval for major farm decisions and valued my judgment on complex agricultural issues. Looking back on the year that had passed since that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I could measure my transformation in concrete terms. Murphy Agricultural Enterprises had grown from a single farm purchase to a regional agricultural powerhouse. My personal net worth had increased substantially through strategic investments and efficient operations. My professional reputation had evolved from an unknown farm wife to a recognized industry leader. But the most important change was internal. The woman who had once questioned her own perceptions and doubted her own value had been replaced by someone who understood that respect must be demanded rather than earned through submission. The phrase "worthless trash" no longer held any power over me. It had become a reminder of how completely wrong people could be when they allowed prejudice to blind them to reality. Daniel's cruel words had inadvertently freed me from the need to seek approval from those who were determined never to grant it. As I stood on the terrace of my estate that Thanksgiving evening, looking out over thousands of acres of farmland that bore my name and reflected my vision, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. It was the satisfaction of someone who had discovered her own worth and built a life that reflected that knowledge. The Brennan family would always be part of my story, but they were no longer the authors of my future. That pen was firmly in my own hands now, and the chapters I was writing were more compelling than anything they could have imagined for the woman they had so thoroughly underestimated. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and entirely my own creation. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.